Welcome to Interplay Conversations in Music. This is your host, Michael Shapiro, with a very special friend and special guest today, composer Corey Field. Hi, Corey.
Hi, Michael.
Well, great to see you. I'm on the East Coast, you're on the West Coast, and the twain has met in our discussion today about your music. There are two pieces that have recently come out on the major platforms. The first one is a very interesting work called The Trial of Benjamin Britten, dramatic song cycle in 9 scenes for tenor solo, horn, and strings. We'll talk about that instrumentation in a second. And the second half of this
Okay.
conversation is about And I Am Somewhere Worlds Away, which is a very recent piece. It's a dramatic song cycle based upon the poetry of County Cullen for baritone and piano.
Yes, sir.
Now, first about Corey Field. Corey Field is a composer of many orchestral works, many chamber works, many choral works, piano works, 4 symphonies. You beat me by 2 already on the symphony part. Orchestral works that 3 of which I think are wonderful depictions of life in LA and around LA. But I want to talk to you about these 2 very amazing works that have just come out and The Trial of Benjamin Britten. Now, this is a very interesting piece because you use the same instrumentation as his serenade, right?
His famous masterwork, the Serenade for tenor, horn, and strings. Yes, it's the same instrumentation.
Which is a 34-minute piece. And again, it's available on Spotify and YouTube and Apple Music and all those places. But it's in 9 scenes, and it starts with a prologue about the many-sided man, which is interesting, the end of the world, the answer of the sea, a letter from an RAF pilot officer, age 19, what to say and what not to say, love song in time of war, the unfathomable deep, more lives than one, and an epilogue, now a Voyager, which is a takeoff, I think, on the Betty Davis movie. Now,
Well, it's a Walt Whitman poem that was quoted in a famous Betty Davis movie, which was from 1942, which is the exact time period of Britten's life in this work. So it's a fun coincidence, but it's not taken from a Betty Davis movie. But it's a great movie and an incredible music score, by the way.
it is, it's
Yeah.
wonderful. So let's talk about why this piece. Now, his conscientious objection to the
Right.
violence of World War II, as well as Peter Pears as well, is looked back by many of us as a controversial stance. Because, you can say you're objecting to Vietnam, you can say you're objecting to Israel, Gaza, you can say you're objecting to this, objecting to that. However, in my mind, when faced with Nazism in the form of what Hitler did and his gangsters, as Yehudi Menuhin called them, but a whole country of them, there's nothing like it in history. So the fact that he was a conscientious objector, which I will say was interesting because in 45 he played at a concentration camp accompanying
Mhm.
Yehudi Menuhin.
Right.
And
That's
that
right.
experience apparently changed him for life.
That's what he
You know,
said.
that's what he
Yeah.
said, right?
Yeah.
But it's fascinating what you did. A dramatic song cycle following really a drama. It's kind of a quasi mini opera in a way.
Yeah.
What started this? How did this start in your mind?
Well, just to be sure all of your viewers and listeners know, Benjamin Britten is widely considered to be one of the great 20th century composers. He was from a small town on the eastern North Sea coast of England called
Mm,
Lowestoft, very near Aldeburgh, where he ultimately founded the famous Aldeburgh Music Festival. So this
yep.
was a major figure in British musical life and world music. And of course, one of his breakthrough great work was an opera set in the Aldeburgh fishing village where he was from called Peter Grimes. So
Mhm.
that's the background. What I have been interested in, I've had my own odyssey in life. I actually began my studies and my composing career in England many years ago. And so Britain and other aspects of British musical life perhaps loom a bit larger for me. But I'm
Mhm.
originally from Los Angeles. And after a long odyssey of my own, where I was a music publisher on the East Coast and did other things, I returned to Los Angeles, my hometown. And I was astonished to discover, just randomly by reading about Britain, perhaps, I don't even remember, that he had a major life episode in and around Los Angeles and Hollywood in the early 1940s. And what happened was in 1939, before World War II broke out, he and
Right.
Peter Pears, who became his life partner, sailed to America. They stopped in Canada, came to America,
Mhm. Mhm.
and Britain was very much figuratively and literally at sea. He was a great friend of W.H. Auden, the poet. Auden
Mhm.
had gone to New York previously with his lover Christopher Isherwood, the writer, and had established a house in Brooklyn where he sort of wanted to have an artist colony. And he encouraged Britain to come there and experience what it might be like in America to be an artist, to be a gay artist in America. And Britain, somewhat dissatisfied with his life and career in England, made the voyage. And so it's 1939, World War has not broken out yet. He's got some performances and commissions. He's
Right.
living in Brooklyn and living in Long Island. And then the war breaks out. And it becomes clear, a couple things become clear. One is that when he and if he goes back to England, he will stand trial as a conscientious objector. He was very much committed to that. Another British composer, Michael Tippett, was the same. He actually went to prison as a conscientious objector. You have
Right.
to remember that this generation, born within the first 10 or 15 years of the 20th century, had experienced everyone they knew had lost someone in World War One, and it seemed like a
Yeah.
waste. And so
Mhm.
they wanted to not fight.
Right.
So in America, Britain had this odyssey. He didn't know what he wanted. He thought he might want to become a Hollywood film composer.
You
They
tried.
made their way to They drove across the entire United States in
Right.
1941. What a journey, right? And they make their way to Southern California, and Britain is he's now as far from England as you can get.
End of
Uh,
the world.
End of the world on the coast. You know, in those days, after once you hit the Pacific Ocean and you wanted to write string quartets, you had gone as far as you can go geographically if you wanted to be part of what they called at that time Western culture. And
Right.
he's very much ambivalent. He's scared. He knows he's going to
Right.
face trial. He's fallen in love with Peter Pears. And you have to remember in England, that was against the law. Oscar Wilde went to prison for being
I know.
gay, died soon after. And it's in Los Angeles that his life turns around. They find in a bookstore the poem by an obscure British poet, which became the basis for his opera, Peter Grimes. And he
Right.
decides, okay, I have found my mission. I must return to England come what may. I'll stand trial. I must write this opera. I now know who I am and what I must do. And I thought all of those conflicts, he's an artist in a world that doesn't want art. He's a gay man at a time when you had to hide that and it might ruin your career and you might go to prison. He's a conscientious objector at a moment when, as you pointed out, this wasn't just any old conflict. This was one of the most evil empires in world history. And by
Oh,
the way, I
most
think
evil.
many people still wonder about that. Like,
I
did
wonder
Britain
about
ever, yeah, did Britain ever have doubts about having been, had that position? And then he actually had a trial in London.
it. Right.
And he had witnesses. William Walton, the famous composer of Belshazzar's Feast and other works, was a witness for Britain to say this is a valued musician. He should be eligible to not get killed.
Right.
And he had a trial. The initial result was not satisfactory to him. He was very adamant about this. They offered him what was usually the result is, okay, you'll have to be in the army, but you can wash dishes and peel potatoes. You won't have to kill anyone. He rejected that. And he said, no, the only thing I want is complete nothing to do with it. And he
Okay.
appealed and he won.
I know he
But
won. He won because of who he was. But in my mind, to be a conscientious objector against Nazi during the time of Nazism, it makes no sense to me.
yeah.
As
And
a creative artist, I understand his position. And in '45, when he played at that concentration camp for the survivors
mhm,
with Yehudi Menuhin, it killed him to his core.
yeah.
I would have loved to have spoken to him about that. I did know Peter Pears. I spent one day when I was at Juilliard with Peter Pears, and I accompanied him around. And when he was in New York, and Britain at that time was suffering his fatal illness,
Mhm.
but he hadn't perished yet. But it would have been interesting to have spoken to him. So let's go back to your piece.
Okay.
So, how did you put together these 9 movements? Where did you find this material, and how did they generate musical thought?
So this is actually part of the great lesson of Britain's own music, and goes back to what you said about his own serenade for tenor, horn, and strings.
Yeah,
Britain was very much in that line of composers who invented the song cycle. Okay, not a collection of random songs, but a cycle with a theme.
right,
Beethoven and On der Ferne Geliebte. It's a
correct.
short set of songs, but it's about one topic. The example, of course, is Der Winterreise, The Winter's Journey by Schubert, which is 20, I think it's 24 songs,
It's
all
huge.
about one dramatic journey. It's a mini opera. Schumann's Dichterliebe. So the examples are there.
Right.
Britain was a master of this, and so and that if you're a composer, that's how you do a song cycle. You
Yes.
actually have a dramatic arc embedded in your selection of songs so that the listener is taken on a true journey, almost like a sonata form, where
Hmm.
there's a beginning and introduction of characters and a development and a conclusion and a coda. That's, this sonatas are dramas. And Britain was a master at that. And so, and other composers. And so, with that in mind, I wanted to tell the story of his American Odyssey, 1939 to 1942, ending with his return to London and standing trial. And so I sought out poems that would give me that drama. The first poem is from Homer's Odyssey. It's
Right.
about the many-sided man taking a voyage. The next scene is it's the trial. The work is structured so the trial is at the beginning, and then we have flashbacks. It's that sort of it's a flashback type of a structure.
Hmm.
And for that, I started with him being sworn in. And for those who know Peter Grimes's opera, guess what? It starts with a trial scene.
But I'm
Peter
bum, bum.
Grimes is on trial.
Yeah.
And to me, the connection between Britten's life and his work is so clear in that moment.
Oh my God,
Um,
the whole opera.
yeah, and the opera is about this outcast and all of these things. And I then, as I researched, and my main research focus was a wonderful volume of his own letters, 1939 to 1945. So my sources about his life during this period are from his own letters. That's my main source. And in that volume they quote his actual prepared testimony at his trial, and I
Wow.
used that, and it's beautifully written. He says, I believe everyone's made in the image of God and I can't destroy them.
Yeah, that's
I
a
mean, what
Quaker.
a,
That's also a Quaker thought.
yeah,
In
he
everyone, there is a spark. But
exactly.
when we deal
And
with Nazism, Corey,
yeah, I know. And
somebody like me who
so
lost
so
almost
then
family
what
in Treblinka, it's a problem.
it's a problem. So just to, and I want to quickly get through how I chose poems to reflect this
Yeah, please.
overall dramatic arc. And by the way, the Britten Peers Trust very kindly gave me permission to quote Britten's own words in that one scene.
Wow.
So So I was very relieved that, I was worried they'd say, "Who do you think you are writing a piece about?" No, they were very
Well,
kind
there
and
it's very interesting group of people.
so so now he's standing there on trial testifying, and he starts having flashbacks. And so the next song is about his voyage to America. And I must have Googled something like poems about sea voyages. I don't remember, Michael,
The
but
Answer of
I
the
got,
Sea is what it's called.
yes,
The Answer of the
it's
Sea.
called,
Yeah.
but the poem is called Self Dependence by a British Victorian poet who's not particularly popular named Matthew Arnold, although there's an interesting music connection with him and Samuel Barber I'll mention in a moment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, it's called, the poem begins, weary of myself and not sure who I am and what I want to be,
Right.
I'm on this ship sailing. It's exactly what Britain did. And when I found it, it's like, oh my God, thank you, Google. And then the next, what happened is people noticed that Britain was not there as war broke out, and there was an RAF pilot officer who
It's the
wrote a
letter.
nasty letter to the Musical Times in London.
It's really quite something.
Yeah.
I read it
Why
this
are
week.
we playing this guy's music? He's gone off to America with his friends. And this was it's an actual letter, and it's outraged. And when I first read it, I thought, oh, this sounds like some established person sitting in his London club sipping
No,
brandy
not in this
who had
case. It was a 19-year-old RAF officer.
the guy who wrote the letter was 19 years old. And
Yeah.
guess what? A lot of the people who saved Britain in the Battle of Britain flying Spitfires were 19 and 20 years old.
They were kids.
They were kids.
But
And
just to touch on one more thing, Sir Thomas Beecham was not in England during the war. He was in Australia and in the States, and he was heavily criticized for
I see.
it.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So, and I know I need to wrap up this part of our conversation, but
But we'll
um,
get to County Cullen very shortly.
yeah, but what's very moving is if you think about it, this 19-year-old pilot who's risking his life. And by the way, he was eventually shot down and served time in a German prisoner of war camp and severely
Rescued
injured.
by the Russians of all people. Yeah.
Well, yeah, as the Russians made their way west, they liberated the prisoner of war camps.
Mm.
And he and Britain actually had a lot in common. They were both risking their lives. The pilot was literally risking his life flying the Spitfire.
Right.
Britain was risking his life in every way and his career by being a conscientious objector. As far as he knew, it might completely end his entire career. He didn't know for sure. And in that sense, they're both the same person, and I find that fascinating. Um, yeah,
The rest of these movements are fascinating. If I can just go through them quickly, is
yeah,
what to say and what not to say, which is very much what Peter Pears was coaching his partner in.
yeah.
Love Song in Time of War, which is a gorgeous piece. The Unfathomable Deep, More Lives Than One, and then Epilogue, Now Voyager.
Yeah.
So, Corey, I really, we're going to put up the link right now
Thank you.
to show people where they can go on Spotify to hear The Trial of Benjamin Britten, which is an amazing piece of music using, again, the same instrumentation that is in the serenade that Britten
Right.
wrote.
And that seemed to me, it's funny, I researched it and almost no one has written for that same instrumentation possibly because the Britain piece is so perfect. How
Yeah, it
dare
is.
you? How dare
Well,
you?
I think that people are scared too. I mean, that happens. you
It
know,
happened.
now let's shift, if we may, to a poet who I knew nothing about, and that is County Cullen, who uh, actually was James Baldwin's teacher
Mhm.
at a junior high school in New York. But before that, this cycle is only it's not with orchestra, but it's baritone and piano, and it consists of seven works from Heritage, When the Rain Begins to Fall, which is fascinating. Fruit of the Flower, Yet Do I Marvel, She of the Dancing Feet Sings, The Wise, Singing in the Rain, and For Myself. It's a 25-minute piece. Now, this again is a dramatic song cycle, and it comes out of what you describe in your program notes as the deeply personal world of the poems of County Cullen. Now, the terrible business about County Cullen, who was a leading poet of the Harlem Renaissance, was that although he was born in 1903, he died at the age of 43 and 46.
Mhm.
And he had a very early rise when he married Yolande Du Bois, the daughter of W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, fascinating aside, we were in Lenox 2 weeks ago just to visit, friends who were playing at the Tanglewood Festival, and at the local library, I think it was in Great Barrington, they had a whole display about W.E.B. because he was from that area.
I
But
never saw
when County Cullen married his daughter, and in a marriage that didn't last very long, it was a huge event in the Harlem Renaissance community. But my question is, because I know a lot about art and a lot about the Harlem Renaissance, I had never heard of County Cullen until you told me about him. So how did you find this poet?
You know, I wish I could remember how I found it. I'm always reading poetry. I'm always reading literature. I'm a composer. In the back of my mind is, is there something great I've missed? Just like, is there a great piece by Mozart I've missed? I'm
Well, you got
terrified
a
that
lot of
maybe
listening left.
there's a lot. There's a lot to discover. I don't remember exactly how I stumbled on his poetry, but I can remember the lightning bolt. It's like, oh my God, this is a it's an unspeakable injustice that when I was in high school, they weren't having his poems in front of me,
No one
right?
saw this. No.
No, well, we have to be careful because I have found that those who have made it a priority to be sure they know about leading African American poets, they know of him. And I think this is a good example of how now in our artistic world we're righting wrongs. County Cullen should be one of the greatest American poets of the first half of the 20th century. And part of the reason I'm very proud of this piece is I hope that some people will discover that truth. Um,
Now
but
let's
the
talk about approach, because this to me is very important as a writer, as a composer. When one finds a piece that turns one on, as it were, and you feel you can add something to it, here's the rub in writing songs. I've written about 100 songs over the years, not all of them published because I cut away many of them. But I do remember the words of Aaron Copland, who was one of my mentors, who is not known really as a songwriter. Well,
mhm.
he was an instrumental guy, right? Although he wrote songs,
The
and
Emily Dickinson songs are the big
that's the
one.
famous one, right? Okay. But Aaron said that when he wanted to find a poem that he would set, or as he was a very voracious reader, as you know, he wanted to find something that had not too much music in it, which you, as a writer who's influenced by Shakespeare, will have this in your head. If the poetry has a lot of music in it, in the words and the selection of syllables and vowels, very hard to write music to that kind of stuff. To be or not to be cannot be set. It's very difficult. But you found these poems by County Cullen, who talks about living behind the veil, the life of a bisexual man in that time. And what said to you, like Aaron Copland's comment about finding the music in words that needed music? Why does why do his poems need Corey Field's music?
Well, I would never make that claim, but
No, but you should, because you found the music in the words and you set them in this dramatic song cycle. So why did it turn you on that you felt I can add something to these words? They're not completely self-sufficient.
well, Cullen, first of all, like Britain, was a man of great conflicts. He was an artist. He was a black man in America. He was a gay black man in America. He was a black poet. This is all in the 1920s when he wrote The particular poems I chose are from his collection Color and one other source.
Very
Uh,
early, 22 years
and
old, something like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
the thing that really grabs me with Cullen is that he finds this balance between letting you inside his head and yet being at a distance and symbolic. You know,
Mhm.
you mentioned Shakespeare. Shakespeare never lets you inside his head. He's on some other plane where
Right.
he's giving you words that are coming from some galactic Mount Olympus, and they mean so much, and obviously they've lasted centuries. Cullen lets you inside his head, but at the same time, he's not indulgent. He
Mm.
lets you inside you're inside his mind, and yet he's being objective about what he sees. It's an amazing combination that is very much like you become Cullen as you read his poetry.
Fascinating.
And he's obsessed with music. He's constantly writing about song and music. He's obsessed with natural forces. Rain is a metaphor in all his poems. It's mostly beating down, and he overcomes the rain as this metaphor for nature's opposition to life. Sometimes it's a little more positive.
Did
Um,
you find anything in any of the writings of James Baldwin where he talks about County Cullen's influence on him? Did you? Uh,
I made a note of that. Cullen was a superstar as a youth. W.E.B. Du Bois. This was just for your listeners who don't know that part of history. This was like marrying Martin Luther King's daughter. This is
oh,
like,
huge, huge.
yeah, it was an enormous like societal moment. It
Right.
was like a royal wedding in Harlem, honestly. And so I read, that was fascinating. But by the time he mentored James Baldwin, he had stopped writing poetry. He had tried to write a novel. He had was getting involved in some theatrical sort of libretto work, and he was a junior high teacher at Frederick Douglass Junior High.
Right.
And what a great historical moment that of all people, James Baldwin and him were sort of, that would be a great play right there. County Cullen and James Baldwin, the former, comet of what the movements of that time,
Right.
with a man who was very much involved in the next steps.
Right.
Um, yeah, Cullen is quite a figure. And it's almost not surprising he may have burned himself out as a poet, given the personal inner intensity of his poetry.
Now you discussed when we were talking about the Britain piece about arc. So, in your mind, what is the dramatic arc of your setting of these wonderful poems of County Cullen, which you call "And I Am Somewhere Worlds Away"? So, how do you view the dramatic arc in these pieces?
This is a life. This is a birth to death dramatic arc. It starts with him laying down in the dark in the rain, hearing the rain on the window in Harlem,
Right.
contemplating what it means to be a black man in the 1920s, remarking on heritage is a very long, wonderful poem about the separation from the original African Eden. And I took from that just a repeated line where heritage is framed with the poet saying, I'm lying here in the dark, in the rain, thinking about all this. So that's our introduction. And then there are poems that are about his parents, and it's almost like his childhood, how he's different from his parents.
Right.
Then there's a poem about being a black poet. There's a poem about joy that might be considered sinful, but you cannot deny. There's a poem about death. There's a poem called Singing in the Rain, which predated the movie by 30 years,
Yeah, I know.
which is about overcoming obstacles and singing your song. And then he wrote his own epitaph. For myself is him talking from the grave and from eternity. So this is really a birth to death cycle.
Now, what you have just described is universal relationship or universal inspiration, having nothing to do with person's ethnicity or racial background or anything like that. There are some people recently, I spoke to opera director recently who said that Porgy and Bess is now a very impossible piece to set on stage because of the recent developments. a piece about black people in Charleston at a certain time in a book written by a white man, although a Charleston person, in Du Bois Hayward, and written by a Jewish guy from Tin Pan Alley. I don't agree with any of that view because, and I don't agree with the fact that Corey Field of LA has set the words of County Cullen to very dramatic and moving music. Because the best art in my mind is universal art. And it can be approached by anybody who has the kind of integrity and love that you show. Do you agree with those comments?
Well, in the times we live in, those same thoughts occurred to me before I wrote the work. It's like, oh boy, is there some other layer here? Um, let's talk about love and commitment. So when I write music, that's where I am. It's something I have to do. It's something I cannot deny. It's something I cannot suppress. I have no choice but to leave it to others to decide whether it's okay. I
Yeah.
can't, to me, there's no question. It's okay. I must do this. I'm in love with this project. I'm in love with these words. I'm in love with this music.
Or you've
And
gone
I'll
to
let
the core
others.
you've gone to the core of it. I was asked by a conductor recently. I remember going to lunch with her and she was saying to me, "Why do you compose?" And I looked at her. I said, "Are you hungry? Why do you eat?
Yeah.
And
So,
why do we have conversations like this, which I must leave right now?" Corey Field, dramatic composer of beautiful lyrical works with great arc. We've talked about your trial of Benjamin Britten for, you know, a dramatic setting with French horn and orchestra and with a singer, and now the County Cullen song cycle, which is dramatic for baritone and piano, and I Am Somewhere Worlds Away. This is just a touch of the work of Corey Field as a composer. Many of his pieces are available on wonderful recordings. These are two very recent ones. And we're going to leave you all with ways of jumping right in on Spotify or the other platforms so you can hear these very important works and revel in them. They're the kinds of works, I should add, that one hearing is not enough. You have to keep on listening. And it's a gem of a thing. The great news about Corey's works is that you can read about them at First Leaf Music, First Leaf, Leaf music.com, which is his website. And you can go there and read wonderful program notes about these and other pieces, and also about the progress of his recordings. One last question before we go.
mhm.
Live performances versus recorded performances. I was at Tanglewood a few weeks ago and spoke to a wonderful, famous violinist. And he was talking about legacy and his legacy because he does tremendous public performances all over the world, which are heavily attended because he's such a famous violinist. And we were talking about legacy, but I said, but there's another aspect to this. If you own your recordings, there's a financial aspect, but also the number of people who can listen to a recording versus the number of people in a concert hall are now inverted. It used to be the other way around, that the public performance was the ball game. But now, with downloads and with most people having one of these, it's become a different ball game. Do you think about that, Corey, as far as the dissemination of Corey Field's music?
Of course I do. I can only control what I can control. I can control whether I'm capable of composing, which
Right.
to me is a miracle. We're not going into biography much here, but the fact I write any music at all at this point is a miracle that I'm very grateful for
But you have to, Corey.
because I have to. I can control uh, money for making recordings to some extent. It's not an it's not an unlimited budget,
Right.
but I have control over that, and I can given enough time, I can pay for and release recordings on my own label. I would love for people to perform this live. but I cannot control that. And if it happens, it would be fantastic. But I'm on a mission to write music and make it available to others. And if there's a next step where that results in more live performances, I'd be thrilled beyond words. But I'm also very conscious of what I can do, what I can create, and that's my focus.
Well, this is certainly the focus of many composers today, just to get the word out and to as many people as possible, depending on what you did. So I tell our viewers today, be sure to start with Corey Field's two latest recordings, his Trial of Benjamin Britten, and these wonderful settings of the poetry of County Cullen and I Am Somewhere Worlds Away, both available as new releases and on Spotify and the other platforms. Corey, thank you so much for joining me
Thank
today.
you.
It's
Thank
been a,
you. Thank you so much.
it's been a great pleasure. I'm Michael Shapiro. Conversations in Music. This is Interplay. See you next time. Great to see you, Corey.
Thank you.